Thus far in this course, we always built Angular applications that worked on their own, that needed no data from a database and didn't try to save any data in a database. And that's going to change now in this section, because in this section, you will learn how to connect a backend to your Angular application and how to send HTTP requests to that backend and how to deal with responses you're getting back from that backend. For that, you'll learn how you can connect an Angular application to such a backend and potentially to a database, therefore. And you will learn how you can then fetch data from there or send and store data there. And we'll also explore how we can handle loading and error states, which is an important concept when working with such a backend. And therefore, in this section, we'll work on a brand new demo project where now for the first time, the data will not be stored in memory or as part of the Angular application or something like that. Instead, we'll operate on data that's coming from a backend and that's in the end also stored there. Now, for this section, as always, you find a brand new starting project attached, and this attached project actually is the combination of two projects, you could say. It's an Angular application, but it's an Angular application that also has this backend folder inside of it. And that's now a folder that holds no Angular code at all. Instead, it's a totally separate kind of application, which I simply included into this Angular application folder for simplicity. But you could move that backend folder out of this project and run that backend somewhere else on your computer, and you would still be able to work with it. I just put it into this project folder here to keep these files together, because this backend folder now contains a very simple Node Express application, which has nothing to do with Angular. And it's in the end a simple API, a simple web API that's included in this app.js file that accepts GET requests to various paths, to various routes, and also some other requests like put and delete, which we can use to store data here as well. Now, in this dummy application, I do have some JSON files prepared that contain some data, at least one of them does, and will therefore still operate on some dummy data here, but now dummy data that's not part of the Angular app, but instead of the backend, to simulate a scenario where we have a real backend we might be talking to. I'm also not using a database here, but instead these files for storing data, but in the end, the result, of course, is the same, because a database in the end is also just data stored in files, just of course in a more efficient way. But to keep things simple, this backend will simply store and access data in these JSON files, but the main idea is the same, that we manage that data in a backend and not in the Angular application itself. Instead, in this section, you will learn how to reach out to that backend from inside your Angular application. Therefore, what you should do after you downloaded this project is you should of course run npm install, as you always should, to install all these Angular dependencies. But once that's done, you should also navigate into that backend folder in your terminal and also run npm install there to also install the dependencies of that backend project. Because again, it essentially is a separate project with its own dependencies. And then still navigate it into that backend folder in your terminal. You should run npm start to start that backend web API. And you should keep that process up and running, otherwise you'll not be able to connect to it from your Angular app. Though you can stop at any time by pressing Ctrl+C if you need to. then you should just restart it by running npm start again if you want to work on this application again. And now in a separate terminal, in a separate tab or a totally new terminal window, you should go into your main project folder again. So not into the backend folder, but the main project folder. And there also run npm start to start that Angular application, that Angular development server again. And once you did that, you should see a page like this on the screen if you visit localhost 4200. And that's now the application we'll work on, and will, for example, start by making sure that we populate this available places box here with some data that should indeed be fetched from the backend. And therefore the question is, how do we connect Angular to that backend, and how do we get access to the data that's stored in those files there? So that's stored in that database there, you could say, even though it's technically not a real database, but it works in the same way here. How do we get access to that? Now, when building an Angular application that should interact with data that's stored in files or in a database, it's important to understand that you don't directly talk to a database from inside your Angular application. Instead, your Angular code, in the end, runs in the browser of your website visitors. And therefore, putting code in there that would connect to a database and therefore contain database credentials would be insecure. And there also very likely would be performance issues and so on. So you don't directly talk to a database from inside your Angular app. Instead, the idea is that you have some kind of web API, either one you built on your own or some third-party API you might want to use in your project, to which you then talk from inside your Angular app. So which you then do connect to your Angular app. And therefore the main question is how you connect an Angular app to a backend, so to such an API, for example. So how do you connect an Angular app to a backend API? Well, it of course starts with that Angular app, the so-called frontend or client-side application that's running in the browsers of your website visitors. And you then have such a backend API, as I mentioned before, the so-called server side, which can be owned and operated by you, but which could also be some API provided by someone else. And what's important here is that the website visitor won't have direct access to that API. It's running on some separate server, and the code base there and the data there is isolated from the outside world, except for some routes, some explicitly provided URLs to which the frontend application, the Angular application, can send requests. And that is indeed what it will do. That is how you connect an Angular application to a backend. You send HTTP requests from inside the Angular app, so from inside your Angular code to that backend API, for example, to fetch some data, but also, for example, to send some data to the backend and store it there. Both is possible and both will be covered in this section. Well, and that backend API then responds with a response, which, for example, includes the requested data, which can then be used from inside your Angular code again. So which can then be used in the Angular application to, for example, update the UI. And that's what I want to do here in this application now. I want to send a request to the backend that gives me some data about places we might want to visit, and we therefore can pick here, that I can output in this available places box here. And thankfully, that backend API in the backend folder has a route for that, because it does accept GET requests sent to the backend domain /places. And then there it will fetch the data from the database, or in this case from this JSON file, and send back a response that contains those places. So our goal now is to send such a HTTP request from the Angular app to the backend by using this route, by sending a GET request to this backend path. And that's what we'll do now in the next steps.